See, I'm thrilled and deeply honoured to win the Westminster Medal, partly because of its reputation. One only has to see the previous winners, all of whom are writers and on the subject whom I greatly admire. I think it's always difficult to predict how any book will impact on historiography. One hopes that it will certainly widen the approach. I mean, I think much of the military history in the past has never really looked at the effect on civilians and also on the political consequences, which were quite large in the case of France. The whole of the French-American relationship was badly damaged in 1944, and so one needs to understand the Franco-American tensions which continued as a result of that. But in terms of historiography, obviously, as everybody knows, no book is definitive, far from it, and one can never expect that. All you can hope to do, really, is to, say, push forward the boundaries of knowledge with new material. And I think I was very lucky in the way that there hadn't been a major general history of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy for quite a long time, even for 20 or 25 years. And a huge amount of new material have become available in archives, particularly in France and the United States, but above all in France, particularly in the Mémorial de Caen, where people approaching death who'd been eyewitnesses or taken part left their papers and diaries to the museum and to its archives. Because what I found was that there had been too many eyewitness accounts, but interviewed many, many years later. And what I really was trying to do in this book was to actually go very much more for the contemporary material, the reports, the diaries and so forth of the time. Because I think the trouble is that it's not a question in any way of sort of veterans trying to exaggerate or it's just that human memory is fallible, and so many have read so many accounts about D-Day that they've tended to filter their own experiences through what they've read subsequently. There are a number of parallels with sort of contemporary conflicts which I think are worth noting. One of the things which struck me very much in writing about the Battle for Normandy is that there was this terrible paradox that actually the armies of democracies are more likely to kill civilians simply because the generals are under such pressure from Parliament, from public opinion and the press back home in a democracy to reduce their own casualties to as far as possible, which will obviously impel them to use as much high explosive in terms of artillery or air power to reduce enemy strength. And of course, inevitably in those circumstances you get a much higher rate of civilian casualties. I mean, in Normandy the figures are pretty frightening, 15,000 killed even before D-Day in the preparation, and another just over 20,000 during the campaign. So that is slightly worrying in a way, because obviously one sees the counterproductive effects in political terms and all the rest of it. And inevitably it's something which, of course, the coalitions in Afghanistan and elsewhere, of course, is extremely conscious of. You are bound to have collateral damage, as the Americans called it, and that is not only immoral, amoral or whatever, but has got to be avoided at all costs for political reasons. You're not going to be able to avoid it completely. That is the nature of warfare, sadly. And at least the weapons are a hell of a lot more accurate now than they were in 1944. I mean, the area bombings and all the rest of it were, of course, bound to bring in huge casualties. My interest in the Second World War, obviously, is a fairly wide one. I mean, I've also covered the battle for Spain, the Spanish Civil War. But it is the period which has completely dominated my childhood, my life. I mean, my father was in the Second World War, and one therefore seeks to understand it, not just in purely historical terms, but also to understand why it was, in a way, so uniquely evil in terms of the atrocities, particularly on the Eastern Front and of the Nazis. And it tells one a lot, if you like, about humanity and the darker side of humanity. But also, as other writers have certainly pointed out, there was an interesting debate a number of years ago over the Booker Prize, and one writer was saying, well, why is everybody so interested in sort of history and the past and all the rest of it? Another one, in fact, I think it was Robert McCrum in The Observer, argued very cogently that, in fact, moral choice is the basis of all human literature, art, drama, and all the rest of it. And frankly, there was no greater moral choice than in the Second World War. I think there can be no doubt that the Red Army took on and certainly destroyed the bulk of the Wehrmacht. There is absolutely no doubt about that. Unfortunately, there's been a certain sort of American myth-making, the greatest generation myth, and all the rest of it, which has tended to grossly exaggerate the role of the Allies. But then there are various areas which are also ignored on the Soviet side. I mean, for example, the extent of American aid. I mean, the Red Army would never have got to Berlin first if it hadn't been for all the American trucks, which greatly accelerated the advances in 43 and 44. There were also the strategic bombing campaign, whatever one may argue about its morality, had a huge effect on the fighting on the Eastern Front because it forced all of the Luftwaffe fighter squadrons and the bulk of their anti-aircraft guns back to defend the Reich, which allowed the Red Army to use this sort of these huge operations concealed by Mazgirovka, by their deceptions, which would never have been able to be successful if the Germans had been able to fly reconnaissance missions over their lines, but they couldn't because they had completely lost any form of air superiority. So all of these elements, if you like, swing slightly back and forth, and they're all part of the arguments, and sometimes Soviet or Russian historians today certainly will try still to downplay the contribution of the West. But when it comes down to the overall assessment of who destroyed the bulk of the Wehrmacht, the answer must, of course, be the Red Army.